Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be focusing upon a key country in the Middle East that has seen a tremendous amount of tumult, especially over the last 12, 15 years, and that is Syria. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Charles Glass is an American-British author, journalist, broadcaster, and publisher specializing in the Middle East and the Second World War. He was ABC News Chief's Middle East correspondent from 1983 to 1993, and he has worked as a correspondent for Newsweek and The Observer. Mr. Glass is the author of Tribes with Flags, A Dangerous Passage Through the Chaos of the Middle East, as well as a collection of essays. His most recent book is Syria, Civil War to Holy War. Charlie Glass, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to change the format a little bit. Let's just jump right into it. Your book, Syria, Civil War to Holy War, is a fantastic book. It's very interesting, very timely. Why did you decide to write this book?
Interestingly enough, it was the suggestion of my publisher, Colin Robinson at Orr Books, because I've been covering Syria since 1973, off and on. But I took particular interest in the country when the demonstrations began during the Arab Spring of 2011. And I made many trips between 2011 and as recently as this last January. Colin thought I should collect everything I knew over that 14-year period into a book, which is what we have now, Syria, Civil War to Holy War.
I see. Now, the articles I've read and the reporting I've seen done on it, there are two basic causes, and correct me if I'm wrong, it could be, but they said that the Arab Spring and climate change, the climate crisis, were instrumental in basically fueling or setting the stage for this civil disruption that occurred in Syria. Do you see that way, or are there other causes?
No, you're right. First of all, the Arab Spring that began in 2011 in Tunisia, which led when a young man burned himself alive because he couldn't get work and he'd been mistreated by a policewoman, led to massive demonstrations in Tunis and around the country that led to toppling of the regime there of President Ben Ali, who was a military dictator. And that was followed by similar demonstrations in Cairo that produced the overthrow of General Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt. Similar rebellions broke out, peaceful demonstrations broke out all over the Arab world, including in Bahrain. In Syria, the problem of dictatorship was exacerbated by a drought. The drought that particularly hit the south of the country very hard, around Deraa, which is on the Jordanian border in the southern plains of Syria, which is a kind of breadbasket for Syria. And that drought, producing poverty and dislocation of people, together with some graffiti that some youngsters had written on the walls in Deraa against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. The governor of Deraa arrested the children who had done that and tortured them. Well, this was a red line, torturing children. All Arab states and Israel torture people daily. It's not unusual. But torturing children was just unacceptable. So those demonstrations became riots and spread throughout the country. When the government used violence to try and put them down, the demonstrators and the activists had to make a decision whether to continue with civil disobedience along Gandhian lines or take up arms. Some took up arms, some didn't.
This whole situation that we saw unfold in Syria, which was so tragic, we're seeing many situations like that around the world, especially with the climate crisis, with the desertification of the planet, with the rising sea levels, with farmers in Guatemala who can't produce coffee, just on across the board. And I'm sure you're seeing a lot of that in the Middle East, are you not?
You're seeing it dramatically in the Middle East because the Middle East is largely desert, and there's going to be a shortage of water in the whole region, and people are feeling it in some areas already where water consumption is restricted. and people are leaving the farms because there's nothing they can't grow, and they go into the cities, and then they become slum dwellers in the cities, and again a very dissatisfied urban proletariat.
Exactly. And I remember many years ago, and this was quite a few years ago, a couple of decades ago, knowledgeable wag said that water is going to be the petroleum of the next 30, 40 years, and it'll be more valuable in many respects than petroleum will be. And that is certainly coming true, at least as I see it. But anyway, before I forget it, one thing I should have done, apologies for that. I want to mention your website. It's www.charlesglass.net. So for our viewers who would like to go to it and read some other items that you have written, or other issues that you want to talk about, we'll invite them to do that. Let's go into your book. It's an interesting topic, from civil war to holy war. What exactly do you mean? Well, the Civil War, I guess, started off with the the April situation and that type of thing. But how did you get from Civil War to Holy War?
Well, in 2011 and 2012, the demonstrations against the regime in Syria were peaceful. Sometimes the regime army forces would shoot at the demonstrators, and very occasionally some demonstrators would shoot back. There were dramatic discussions, some of which I attended in cafes in Damascus, where the student leaders of the protests discussed among themselves how they should respond to the use of violence against them. And some argued to continue nonviolent civil disobedience demonstrations, general strikes, and so forth, because the government wouldn't know how to deal with that. And they said that the government was built for violence. It was a violent regime, and that if they turned to violence, the country would suffer dramatically, and they might well not win. As the war it became a war, it became a civil war. The opposition was armed. There was something called the Free Syrian Army, which was largely people who had deserted from the Syrian army, many of whose leaders said that they were in support of the demonstrators who were demanding democratic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a free economy, the basic freedoms which basically no one in the Middle East has. And the Free Syrian Army was not a very effective fighting force, as it turned out. The people who became the most effective were the Salafist jihadis, many of whom were foreign fighters from Uzbekistan and Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, and from Syria, who were fighting no longer for democracy, but for an Islamic state, for the imposition of Sharia law. And those people displaced the democratic movements, the democratic fighters and the democratic protesters. And so it became a war between the jihadists and the regime. In the event, because of things that happened externally, the jihadists won. The things that happened externally were, first, Russia, which had supported the regime wholeheartedly and basically saved the regime in 2016 by bombing the rebel-held portions of Aleppo, Syria's second city and its commercial capital, and allowed the regime to take Aleppo back. And that was the beginning of the end of the jihadist onslaught. But the jihadists stayed up in Idlib in the north under Turkish protection. And in the meantime, Russia became distracted by Ukraine, withdrew many of its aircraft to participating in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And at the same time, the other external prop to Bashar al-Assad's regime was a nexus of Iran and Iranian-backed Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon, who fought very hard against the Sunni jihadis in Syria. But from the time of October the 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel, in which about 1,200 Israelis died, Israel turned full force of its military on Gaza and began destroying Gaza. In response, Hezbollah, its leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, decided that they would support the starving people of Gaza by bombing Israel. Well, Israel responded by destroying Hezbollah. I mean, it killed its entire leadership. It destroyed its infrastructure in South Lebanon, and basically its fighters in Syria had to withdraw to be in Lebanon. And so Bashar al-Assad lost Russia, and it lost the Iranian Hezbollah nexus, meant that it was weak. And at that stage, the Hayat Tahrir Hashem, which the leading jihadist group in Idlib, inspired by Turkey, moved south. It moved south to Aleppo and Homs and Hama, and finally into Damascus, and took the country. And Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow.
When we come back from our mid-show, let's talk a bit about Gaza and also how quickly the Bashar al-Assad government fell, and give some thought to that in just a moment. But you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very important country in the Middle East, and one that's known immense violence over at least the past decade plus, and that is Syria. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Charles Glass is an American-British author, journalist, broadcaster, and publisher specializing in the Middle East and the Second World War. His most recent book is Syria, Civil War to Holy War. Charlie, you're talking about you mentioned Gaza, and the world is just absolutely horrified with what's going on, the vast majority of the people. How is this viewed in the Middle East? Nobody denies, I think it was October 7th, the horrific invasion by Hamas into Israel, that type of thing, taking captives and kidnapping people and what have you. But how has the Israeli, and I don't say Israeli people, I say the Bibi Netanyahu response to deal with this or take some action against Hamas, and which it has done, how is that playing in the Middle East? And is it viewed as a genocide there as it is in many parts of the world?
The populations of the Arab world, Iran, and the wider Muslim world all believe it's a genocide, that it must be stopped immediately. Mm-hmm. However, the governments are doing nothing. Even the Arab states that have diplomatic relations with Israel, who include Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, United Arab Emirates, they haven't even recalled their ambassadors. They haven't done anything, but their people are demanding that something be done. But I have to say, in the Middle East, public opinion doesn't count for very much.
Very true. Very, very true. That's for certain. As an observer, you're an expert. You've lived in that area of the world. What solutions could you offer, or would you offer to Bibi Netanyahu or to anybody who's a key player in dealing with this Gaza nightmare that we're witnessing?
Gaza is an occupied territory, as is the West Bank. The occupation has to end, and Palestinians have to be given statehood. Until that happens, Palestinians are going on to be ethnically cleansed, as they are being in Gaza and in the West Bank. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced in the West Bank since the Gaza fighting began. Until that issue is resolved, I think that there will be recurrences and flare-ups of violence in the occupied territories, and more Israeli onslaughts and destruction of homes and killing of innocent people.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a two-state solution as being viable? I know Netanyahu opposes it. His far right-wing Knesset cabinet opposes it. But a lot of leaders in that area and around the world are still pushing for a two-state solution. Is it feasible and doable?
It is if the Israelis agree to it. Of course, they're the occupying power. They're like a colonial power. We've seen colonial powers withdraw in my lifetime from all over Africa and Asia and give people their self-determination. Of course, the Palestinians are entitled to it just as anybody else is entitled to it. At the moment, they have no rights. They can't vote. They don't have freedom of speech. They can hardly move from one place to another without going through Israeli checkpoints. Their lives are completely circumscribed by the occupier. You end that, and there is very little for them to complain about.
Mm-hmm. I remember one trip to that area. I did go through an Israeli checkpoint. I'm not a Palestinian, but it was not a pleasant situation. And I can imagine, oh, I saw it. It is not pleasant for any of the folks in that area who were not Israelis.
No,
So
there's daily humiliation of
oh
Palestinians,
yeah,
and there's
terribly.
no and no one doubts it. And one of the things that's come out since the Gaza fighting began is that the Israelis no longer deny it. They don't hide it anymore. In fact, their soldiers post pictures of themselves abusing Palestinians, actions of which they're very proud. So things have reached a point where the whole world knows it, the Israeli public knows it, and still no one's doing anything about it.
Mhm. Right. This horrific civil war was shipped back over to Syria that we saw that took place. Who were some of the chief protagonists in this war? Who supported whom and that type of thing? Who kept pouring gasoline on the fire and to keep the battles going?
Well, the Assad regime received support from Iran, from Russia, and from Hezbollah, and that was decisive in the 10 years during which they were on top. On the other side, the United States, Britain, France, Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE supported jihadist militias against the regime. And when those jihadist militias, some of them coalesced into something called the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, took over a large part of eastern Syria and western Iraq, the U.S., which was regarded the Iraqi army as its stepchild because it had created that army and armed that army.
Mm-hmm.
And that army collapsed under pressure from the Islamic State, which captured all that American equipment and used it to seize territory. The U.S. had to change sides vis-a-vis the Islamic State and and sent troops to support Kurds and others who were going to fight against the Islamic State.
Mm-hmm.
That made them effectively an ally of the Bashar al-Assad regime, but in fact, they still wanted to continue their war against Assad, and in fact, they did.
Mm-hmm. Were you shocked, or were many people in that area shocked how quickly Bashar al-Assad fell? So many people, I think, had this idea that he had an iron grip on the country, and it seemed like overnight, within just a couple of weeks, that the rebels overthrew him. Was that a shock to you?
No one was more surprised than the Syrians themselves. I went there just 2 days after Hayat Hashem went into Damascus, and Syrians that I spoke to said that friends of mine had seen the army pulling back from Aleppo. They didn't know why they were pulling back. They didn't know why they were who was in command. Their officers had deserted them. The structure of power in Syria simply collapsed. But again, that was because the two foreign props upon which it depended had vanished. The Iran Hezbollah group and Russia were not there defending it anymore. And these soldiers simply withdrew. I mean, people who lived near the palace where Bashar al-Assad lived said that the soldiers who were guarding the palace didn't even know that he was getting into a car and leaving for Moscow. And the checkpoint in front of the house, they had left a half-full coffee pot and uneaten sandwiches on the chairs in front of the house because they just took off their uniforms and ran away.
Mm-hmm.
The country, the institutions collapsed completely in a matter of days, and that surprised everyone, and it even surprised the Hayat Hashem leadership itself. They didn't realize it was going to be so easy.
It certainly was. It was a tremendous shock to people all around the world. Well, let me ask you the last couple of questions here with the situation today. And of course, we saw during the war that there were so many groups supporting the Syrian people. I know the United Nations World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, Doctors Without Borders, just a whole variety of folks were in that area. And right on the firing line, they were on the front lines. I mean, many of them got killed in the process. How important were these humanitarian groups to help the Syrian people stay alive? And I know they lost, what, half the population fled, but it's still, I guess the majority stayed for the moment. But how important was that?
Well, it was very important. It was very important for the survival of the Syrian people. Remember, the economy collapsed in the war.
Mhm.
The fighting destroyed the infrastructure, destroyed the factories. The factories were looted by the jihadists and the equipment taken to Turkey. The government was unable to provide 24 hours of electricity or clean water. People were begging, and people who were used to a decent standard of living. The World Health Organization, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and all of them were scrambling, going around trying to get donors. Getting donors to commit the money that was needed was very difficult for them. But they did manage to feed many, many people and to house many, many people who would otherwise have died.
Exactly, yes. Well, what recommendation would you make to the Syrian government and to the people who are now supposedly donors or trying to help rebuild Syria as far as how they can get involved and to put the country, it'll never be back together to where it was, but at least try to move in a positive direction.
The United States has lifted the economic sanctions that were crippling the Syrian economy, and that's a step forward for the Syrians. And even people who don't like the new regime are pleased that they'll be able to do business again, that they'll be able to take part in the international banking system so that they can buy the things that the country needs. That's all positive, but it still needs aid because most people are unemployed. I mean, 100,000 or more government employees have lost their jobs, and there are a lot of ex-soldiers who still have their arms and may be susceptible to outside powers encouraging them to fight. There's fighting going on right now in the Druze capital in the south. The Druze are an offshoot of Shiite Islam who live in southern Syria around the city of Sueda. And there's been fighting the last few days between Bedouin tribes and the Druze. And there have been outbreaks of fighting in the northwest where jihadist forces killed at least 1,500 Alawi, another offshoot of Islam, Sunnis of Shiite Islam, killed about 1,500 of them. So there have been regular flashpoints of violence, which have to be contained mainly by providing the economic underpinnings for a normal life. The U.S. still has 1,000 troops there. The Islamic State still exists, and it still launches operations against this new regime because it says, even though this regime of Ahmed Shara is Islamist in its constitution, they think it's not Islamist enough because it has said that it wants Christians and Alawis and Druze and others to be part of the Syrian society, as they always have been throughout history. And they don't like that. They don't want them. They don't believe that these people have a right to exist in Syria, and they're trying to drive them out, and they're occasionally clashing with the regime. It's a very difficult balancing act for the new regime to satisfy its old base of Islamist, Salafist fighters, and at the same time appeal to all of the Syrian communities and the international community that wants those Christians and Alawis and Druze and so on to survive in Syria.
Mhm. Well, Charlie, the hardest question in the last 30 seconds we have, how do the people in that area perceive other countries? For example, the United States, we're into really a withdrawal from international activities. We're cutting back our funding. We dropped out of the UN World Health Organization. We've slashed our U.S. aid programs, all of which have weakened the United States. That we can prove that every day of the week, that we're getting weaker by doing that. But how do they view this isolationist approach that the United States is taking?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Some people would hope the United States would never come back to the Middle East in any form again because they see its role as having been detrimental, having supported dictatorships, having sponsored military coups in Arab countries and in Iran, they would like to see it leave. Others realize that they need international aid, and the bulk of international aid historically came from the United States.
Mhm. Well, Charlie Glass, you've hit on an extremely important topic and one that we're going to be dealing with for the next several decades, probably. I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.